This video was brought to you by Brilliant. The war in Ukraine has upended the balance of power in Europe. That's because Eastern Europe's hawkishness has been vindicated, while Western Europe's preference for diplomacy with Moscow now looks embarrassingly naive. And the subsequent energy crisis has only accelerated this trend, with Western European economies, who are more reliant on European gas, especially than their southern counterparts, worst affected by the subsequent shortage. So in this video, we're going to take a look at how the balance of power is shifting within Europe, whether these changes can last, and what the implications might be for EU policy going forward. So let's just start this video with a quick disclaimer. Obviously, power isn't really measurable in any definite sense. So when we talk about the balance of power shifting in Europe, it is subject to interpretation and dispute. Nonetheless, there does seem to be a strong sense in Brussels and Europe more generally that power in the EU is shifting away from its traditional Franco-German center, mostly towards Poland and the Baltics in the east. So we thought we'd do our best to try and explain what's going on. As we see it, there are basically three things that are causing this shift in power. Firstly, and most importantly, the war in Ukraine. Secondly, the subsequent energy crisis. And third of all, recent election results. And combined, the net effect of these three factors seems to be a more dispersed distribution of power across Europe. Let's start with Ukraine. As we alluded to in the intro, the war in Ukraine has essentially vindicated Poland and its former Soviet neighbors, who were always skeptical of German, French, and Italian efforts at diplomacy with Putin. Conversely, it's made Western Europe, and especially Germany, look embarrassingly naive in their willingness to both negotiate and trade with Russia. Their subsequent hesitation when it comes to arms shipments and sanctions hasn't helped either. In April, Germany apparently resisted an EU-wide ban on Russian gas, and Scholz originally refused to send lethal equipment to Ukraine, only sending defensive equipment like helmets and medical aid. Now, he's since U-turned on both fronts, but Germany's stature within the EU has still suffered. Similarly, Macron's continued efforts at diplomacy and his comments in June about making sure that Russia wasn't humiliated in Ukraine haven't gone down that well with the rest of Europe, especially in the East. Every Baltic prime minister has now cautioned Western Europe about their waning resolve in Ukraine, and Latvia's deputy prime minister even denounced Macron's multiple overtures to the Kremlin as an example of, quote, so-called Western leaders who possess an explicit need for self-humiliation in combination with a total detachment for reality. Like Scholz, Macron quickly U-turned on his early stance, insisting just a few days later that he wanted Ukraine to be victorious and pointing out that his calls were either with Zelensky's approval or at his explicit request. But his Central and European neighbours are clearly still sceptical. The war in Ukraine has also undermined Macron's vision for European strategic autonomy, because it's demonstrated the extent to which Europe is still reliant on the US for security purposes. Now, there is a sense in which Macron has been vindicated here. His basic analysis that Europe is too dependent on the US for its security via NATO has been proven correct, but his solution, a new European defense initiative, looks unlikely to happen now. Both because NATO has been rejuvenated and because Poland and the Baltics are passionate Atlanticists. And to be honest, Eastern Europe has always been suspicious that Macron's calls for strategic autonomy were actually a way for Paris to improve its standing in Europe by replacing the US as the preeminent military power on the continent, and would actually prefer the US and NATO over a French-led European security initiative. And now that the East have more power in the EU, Macron's calls for strategic autonomy look increasingly futile. And even Macron has stopped mentioning strategic autonomy recently, instead preferring to talk in terms of European sovereignty. So that's how Ukraine has shifted the balance of power in the EU, away from its Franco-German centre towards the east. But what about the second factor, the subsequent energy crisis? Well, caused predominantly by Putin's decision to limit gas supplies into Europe, the recent European energy crisis has exposed those countries who were overly reliant on Russian gas pre-crisis, especially Germany. And in retrospect, this entire Nord Stream project looks to have been naive, and the German economy is now paying the price for that. Germany is only barely at its 2019 levels for GDP, making it the worst performing G7 economy, apart from the UK, of course. So if Germany has suffered from the energy crisis, then who's benefited? Well, originally it looked like it was going to be France. France's fleet of nuclear power plants mean that it relies less on natural gas than the rest of Europe. And at the beginning of the crisis, France was even exporting tons of electricity to their neighbours. Earlier this year, France was exporting an average of 8 gigawatts, which, for context, is about 10% of the UK's entire generation capacity. However, over the subsequent months, a record number of France's nuclear power generators have had to be shut down for maintenance, and France is now actually importing energy. The real winners here, then, insofar as it makes sense to call them winners in an energy crisis, seem to be Spain and Italy, which both have access to North African and Mediterranean gas. Spain alone has 6 working LNG terminals, accounting for nearly a third of Europe's entire processing capacity. And it has a pipeline running into Algeria, which will eventually be connected to the Trans-Saharan pipeline running all the way from Algeria down to the Wari gas field in southern Niger. Now, at Germany's request, Spain recently agreed to a new mid-cap pipeline linking Germany's gas system to Central Europe, but insisted that the EU should pay as it would benefit Europe's energy security more generally. Italy has also fared pretty well, thanks to its pipeline connections with Algeria, Libya, and Azerbaijan. And both Spain and Italy have significantly increased their gas exports to the rest of the continent by about 300 and 600% respectively. You get the idea then. The energy crisis has worst affected Central and Western Europe, while Southern Europe has fared fairly well and now has quite a lot of power when it comes to energy. On to the third factor though, elections. Again, the big one here is in Germany. The election of Scholz has seriously undermined Germany's geopolitical standing. And that's because Merkel was a respected stateswoman who'd been at the forefront of European politics for the best part of 2 decades. While Scholz did have some experience before becoming Chancellor, his understated manner and penchant for U-turns haven't exactly impressed the rest of Europe yet. And his poor domestic approval ratings mean that he's unlikely to even survive the next election. According to the Morning Consult, Scholz's personal approval ratings are at an all-time low of negative 30%, and his SPD party are now nearly 10 points behind the CDU, which means that he's unlikely to have a lasting influence like Merkel did in Europe. Italy has also taken a similar hit since Draghi, a well-known and respected statesman replaced by Giorgia Meloni, who doesn't have much of a profile outside of Europe and is generally a bit Eurosceptic, which leaves Macron, who was re-elected earlier this year, as Europe's sort of de facto leader. All in all, the net effect of these 3 factors, Ukraine, the energy crisis, and this year's elections, seem to see a bit of a shift of power away from France and especially Germany towards the rest of Europe, and especially the East. So what does this mean for EU politics? Well, assuming that the Franco-German duopoly doesn't reassert itself soon, we see 3 possible implications. Firstly, Europe will become more Atlanticist. The Eastern Europeans are pretty friendly with the Americans already and are skeptical of Macron's strategic autonomy plan. In practice, this will mean that NATO will remain as Europe's primary security alliance, and Europe might begin taking a stronger line on China, as the Americans already have. Secondly, it's likely we'll see more debt sharing in Europe, given that Germany, often supported by the so-called Frugal Four, were usually the main opponents to debt sharing in Brussels, And with their power waning, the other states might get their way. Thirdly, and finally though, this eastward shift puts the EU's green ambitions at greater risk. Given that many Eastern European states, including the Czech Republic and Poland, consider environmental policies antithetical to their economic ambitions. Ultimately though, which of these factors ends up being the most important and the changes that end up coming forth is something we're just going to have to watch play out. And brace yourself, because things like this usually take forever to resolve. And if that hurts your head, then you should check out Brilliant's course on infinity. As a child, I always used to say that the very concept of infinity hurt my mind. And having now taken the course, at least I understand infinity now. But if I'm honest, it does still bother me. It's not just maths either. There's interactive courses on physics, computer science, and a whole variety of STEM topics. Plus, there's some incredibly fun content from your favorite YouTubers too, like Kurzgesagt and a brand new course from our Nebula friends over at Real Engineering. So finish off the year by bettering yourself with Brilliant, where you'll find thousands of incredible courses where you'll learn by doing, as well as discovering whole new ways of thinking. And better still, the first 200 people to sign up using our link in the description will get 20% off an annual premium subscription. Thanks for your support.